and two, looking to the future, which obviously a lot of individual residents are not wanting or willing to do. How do we change these structures in a way that actually facilitates people being able to live and be near where they work, and also in a way that is not detrimental to the environment, because there's so many environmental impacts. I mean, there's so many issues beyond just the immediate maintenance of these places, and yet they're not even willing to do those basic things. It is so frustrating. And I will mention also that I seem to recall that one of the things that you talk about in your book is that one of the cities, they refused to let the public transportation system go to the suburbs. And I will note also that when they were planning, BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit in the 1950s and 60s, sure, it went to San Francisco and it went to the East Bay and the Far East Bay, Walnut Creek, where I also lived for a time, but they absolutely refused to let it come to Marin.
And it's actually really important that you're bringing this up, because I think part of the problem that we have, and even just talking about suburbia, is that it's really this kind of fractured, crazy, quilt of communities that are scattered all over the place. And often they're competing with each other. They're very small. It's just really hard to find patterns across suburbs because there's so many, and there are often, there's so much going on there. But once you start kind of widening the lens and look kind of common issues around schools, around transit, around development, around zoning, it's like, oh, wait, this is actually a very clear pattern that we see again and again. And in many ways, it does go back to, the root of it goes back to what you talked about earlier, kind of the historic origins of post-war suburbia, which in many cases were built explicitly with federal government support as a means of really creating safe havens for upwardly mobile middle-class white families to kind of reap all these advantages and keep everyone else out. That legacy of racial exclusion really, really lives on today. And so part of what, in terms of thinking about how do we find our way out of this, like that ended up being like the model of hope for me was actually the most surprising of all. It was Compton, California. And I think part of what Compton had going for it, it's a place where, the bottom really fell out starting in the 1970s. Again, starting in the public schools, massive debt, quick demographic changes. You started to see this kind of violence and capital disinvestment. And then you had this like really, really rough couple decade stretch, but they're coming out of it now, starting in the public schools. And part of why they're able to do that is because there aren't any white people there left. Mm-hmm. And so the conflict, it's still really tense between Black Compton and Latino Compton. And there's a lot of kind of interracial conflict that's been going on for decades now there. But when you have this kind of thing of saying, okay, we're going to try and invest in all of the kids who were historically excluded from suburbia. That means Compton's unified population, 96% Black and brown, largely poor, often immigrants, some undocumented, some still learning English. Those kids are getting very much the same deal that I got when I was a kid. These things, so not just resources, but this sense of that he is the one who is going to make our future. That's something we haven't historically been willing to do for all families in suburbia. And I think that's really the key, is saying, how do we make this social contract more inclusive?
It's really fascinating to me, the fact that you mentioned, like, once the white people go away, things start to get a little better because there aren't so many people like just digging in their heels and complaining about things anymore. It really is amazing. I wonder how often you see that happening, especially given the fact that now the majority of school kids in suburbia are people of color. Because there seems to be so little hope to me on a federal and even a state level in terms of how the politics is just obstructed again and again. It seems unlikely to me that the solution comes from that area. And what you say about individual communities gives me hope. Like, what strategies can these communities use in order to, help reverse the damage that has been caused by these years of neglect or just kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, and I mean, I think just the one, I want to make sure I'm being clear on my end that when white families start to leave a suburban community en masse, there's a lot of negative consequences that often come with that in the short term.
Sure.
So they're particularly the tax base, white families like to take our tax dollars with us. We don't like to share that money.
Right.
And so when we take that out and kind of the disinvestment that follows, like that's a big part of why Compton struggled for so long.
No.
And we see that in a lot of other
Totally. And
well.
I get that, but also in a very cynical way, I mean, more money, more problems in terms of suburban communities. So I don't know. But how have these communities found ways to make things better, because they don't seem to be getting a lot of outside help?
Yeah, and I think part of it is, part of what I talk about in the book is we had this moment with COVID where it shined this really bright light on a lot of these tensions and problems, and in many ways made them worse. But the federal government, and this is both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, passed $190 billion in relief for K-12 schools.
Right.
And it was called ESSER dollars. And so that's, a not insignificant chunk of change. And so what I saw in a place like Compton is, you have a 20,000 student school district that's getting tens of millions of dollars that it otherwise wouldn't have had. And so part of that is going to, pay for remote school and disinfectants and those kinds of things. But part of what it allows them to do is start repairing some of this infrastructure, start addressing some of these underlying challenges. So on one hand, it's almost like this little pilot or a glimpse of what kind of investment we would need in order to start rebuilding and repairing some of these communities. Now, the challenge is when I talked to the superintendent in Compton, a man named Darren Brawley, and I said, look, you're getting tens of millions of dollars and they just passed this big bond package and you can do this now, right? And he's like, listen, don't get me wrong. I am not going to say no to tens of millions of dollars. It's important. It's valuable. We want it. But just for Compton Unified, just for our schools, and just for the facilities, we need $3 billion. And so, in terms of the scale of the need across suburbia, I think we're dramatically underestimating how profound that is. And again, part of the thing to remember is because so many of these communities were built in such a short period of time, between 1940 and 1970. And so when they all age at once, of course, they're going to need repairs. We just haven't got it in our mind or in our policy to make that kind of investment.
Yeah. And until it hits the people who are in a position of power to be able to do something about it, and who have an influence on things that is outside to their actual population, it's going to be a very slow road. I mean, frankly, richer, whiter people are not going to feel these impacts as much. They're moving out of these areas, and so it's going to be difficult to get policy solutions across. And while it's wonderful that in a situation like COVID, you get an influx and you can see what's possible, clearly they have been pulling back on those programs pretty quickly in a lot of ways, and it's not likely that there are going to be circumstances in which we're going to see that again. And it is very depressing to my mind. I
think part of what is both a little fearful and alarming, but also potentially a room for hope, is that because that option of just moving out and running away from the problem is available to fewer and fewer of us.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is a lot of conflict as a result of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of that conflict is coming up around things like critical race theory and book bans and LGBTQ issues and school curriculum and those kinds of things, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so all of those things matter and are really important, and they make a big difference for families who are trying to make suburbs work for them. But I also believe that a lot of times those we can understand those as kind of symptomatic of this larger issue. And if we're willing as a community to say, hey, what's actually happening in our community is these bills coming due for something that already was taken out of here. And so we need to be able, and we can't escape this. We're all subject to this in one way or another. There's that, at least hypothetically, opens the door to say, hey, we have some common interests here. We may not like each other. We may not even want to live on the same street or send our kids to school together, but we're stuck in this together, and we need to figure this out in a way that my fate is bound up in your fate.
No, that's a good point, because at a certain point, if you have 500 Flint, Michigans across the country where everybody's, water is failing, and you can't just isolate it to one particular, part of the country or one particular type of person. If everybody's, water systems or sewer systems or road systems are failing, then ultimately that holds a lot more weight when those immediate problems come to bear on people than just theoretical things about, critical race theory that have been, ginned up by right-wing media. So maybe you're right. If things get, bad enough in a way that, hits people, and eventually it will hit people, because, as you say, the escape valves are not as available as they used to be, then we can finally, hopefully, come together and solve this.
I would say that's definitely the hope. I hope, people who read Disillusioned walk away with two things. One, this sense of like understanding this pattern that's playing out in your communities all around you. We've historically been very bad at kind of recognizing what's actually happening in suburbia, and I hope this gives us a framework for looking at that. And then also giving us examples of how communities actually start to listen to each other, hear each other. So I appreciate you having me on to talk about it, and excited for this conversation to continue.
Absolutely. Benjamin Herold, again, the author of Disillusioned: 5 Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. Thank you so much for being with us today on Facepalm America.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. I want to thank Ace Elson and Rosabelle Hine, who are the producers. You can always reach us at 202-656-6271, either by message or by calling us. We can get your voice on the program if you would like, or just send us some words and we will read them on the show. And until next time, enjoy the day.